السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. Okay, so I think we're streaming now, yeah? بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم يا منور يا فتاح نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We begin in the name of God Almighty. We beseech Him to send His peace and blessings upon our beloved Master and Prophet Muhammad and upon His family and His companions and all of those who walk in His path of excellence until the last day. So we are on our fourth session in the book, The Deliverance from Error of Sheikh Hujjat al-Islam Abu Hāmid al-Ghazālī رحمه الله تعالى. فقال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. القول في مداخل السفسطة وجحد العلوم. And so this is the section that we're on, the avenues to sophistry and the denial of all knowledge, or skepticism, one can say. And we talked about the term sophistry and all of that. So he says ثم فتشت عن علومي فوجدت نفسي عاطلة من علم موصوف بهذه الصفة إلا من الحسيات والضروريات. So then he says, I interrogated the knowledges that I had, and I found myself deprived of knowledge that could be characterized with that particular characteristic, i.e. that it gives one yaqeen, as we talked about, certainty, except for sense perceptions and evident propositions, things that are evident, self-evident. Right? They're just clear. So what Ghazali is doing here is attempting to investigate these very principles. Are they sound? Are they not sound? And he says, I investigated the things that I held that were knowledge, i.e. that I assumed were yaqeen, that gave me that type of conviction. And the only thing that I could say I had that was quote unquote knowledge per se were my senses, my sense perceptions, and these non-inferential truths or self-evident truths, so daruri knowledge. And as we said, daruri or non-inferentials are those things that are clearly discernible, and the evidence for their veracity are either found in themselves or they're clearly discernible in that manner. So like the classical laws of logic, like we talked about, the law of contradiction, of identity, excluded middle, necessity, or something that's necessary, something that's possible, something that's impossible, that we talked about in our theological course. Does anybody have any questions about those things? I know that it's kind of assuming that we're coming out of the theology course into this course, and so I'm hoping that everybody understands what these terms all mean. Anybody lost? Myself, a little lost. Okay.
What's the middle? You see the middle ruling you said?
Yeah, the excluded middle. So it's that to recognize that a proposition is either true or false, and that there's no third.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So then, and then for sensory knowledge, the senses, al-hiss, is defined as knowledge which the senses will directly reveal to a person. So for example, I touch this and I say this, it's soft, right? Or I touch, this other thing over here and it's rough, right? Etc. So these are the things that Imam Ghazali is saying that he could have yaqeen in, he could have certainty in. فقلت الآن بعد حصول اليأس لا مطمع في الاقتباس للمشكلات إلا من الجليات وهي الحسيات والضروريات. So then he says, now after I have arrived at this sort of, it's very interesting the language that he uses here. It's kind of like, now that I've become kind of sad, right? One can say, over the situation that we're in. Then, and I realized that there's no hope in inquiring about these issues except from things that are evident, right, or manifest in that way, and they are senses and non-inferential, or these evident things. فلا بد من إحكامها أولا. So then it becomes necessary that I understand what these things are first and foremost. ليتبين أن ثقتي بالمحسوسات وأماني من الغلط في الضروريات أهو من جنس أماني الذي كان من قبل في التقليدات ومن جنس أماني أكثر الخلق في النظريات أم هو أمان محقق لا غور فيه ولا غائلة له. Are these things, these sense perceptions and these evident propositions, can I rely on my senses? And am I safeguarded from being wrong about these things that I hold as evident propositions? Or are they things that are similar to what I used to believe when I was simply conforming to what authorities had told me about whatever it is that I knew? Or from the things that the majority of humanity assume that they understand, right? Or is it actually things that give you certainty and that do not contain within it something that would cause you to say it's not true? فأقبلت بجدي. So this is very interesting. So he's basically saying, look, I want to examine these first principles, okay? How one reaches certain knowledge of a thing, and like, what are the avenues that we can take? Are they sound? Let's find out. So if we were to build on these as first principles, then of course they would have to be certain. Otherwise, the whole methodology is built on murky water, or like shaky and unstable foundations. So the question is, how do we know? Like, what is the proof that these things are certain? And so he wants to know, is my reliance on these two means of knowledge, i.e. sense perceptions and evident propositions, are they providing me with certainty for real? Or is it that I'm simply conforming to these things in the same way that, you know, others are conforming to their own principles without real investigation? أقبلت بجد بليغ أتأمل في المحسوسات والضروريات وأنظر هل يمكنني أن أشكك نفسي فيها. So this is very important. So he's interrogating his foundations. He's looking to provide demonstrative proof for them, particularly in this section, whether or not the senses and these non-inferential or these self-evident things are absolutely certain. And he gets into a conversation around what it actually means to be certain through what he addresses at the end. So what does it mean to be certain? Well, for Ghazālī, it's being unable to doubt. And that's why he says, هل يمكنني أن أشكك نفسي فيها? Could I cause doubt? Could I incite doubt in myself about these things? Which is interesting because it shows that this is an epistemological category. It's not a metaphysical category. Okay, and this is very important if people are going to read these texts and try and make assertions. For the falasifa, like Platonic tradition, for instance, okay, they interpret the criterion for certainty as a metaphysical reality. So, which is to say that it creates a criterion according to which objects must be unchanging. So that's talking about the metaphysics of objects, the way reality is. Okay, if knowledge is to be possible, then the things that we know must be unchanging. Whereas Ghazālī here is emphasizing an epistemological position. So he's positing that something that cannot possibly be doubted is certain. And in many ways, Imam al-Ghazālī is actually building on the tradition of the mutakallimun, the theologians that came before him, like Imam al-Juwayni, Imam al-Haramain, rahimahullah, and Imam al-Baqillani, etc. in that he's focusing his examination on epistemological grounds. His goal is to find a foundation upon which all other knowledge can be built, which is termed a foundationalist approach, as opposed to, other theories of knowledge that are out there. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about Imam al-Ghazālī saying that kalam is the universal knowledge and upon which all of the particulars build themselves from. So what he's saying is that as a foundationalist, and foundationalists believe that there must be some kind of bedrock where things bottom out and on which the other things that we're interested in can be founded. Okay? So in many ways, he's very much in agreement with the philosophical tradition that knowledge requires certainty and what that means. But he also rejects aspects of that tradition that posit the idea that the physical world is not knowable because of this particular methodology that they deploy. So what he's deploying to investigate this is not the method of doubt, like those of you who have studied philosophy may have studied Descartes. Okay, and he has the method of doubt, and it's actually interesting that we're reading this because if you read Descartes, you'll see the similarities that come out. Okay, so it's not what Descartes had posited in terms of the method of doubt, but more generally speaking, it's the potential to postulate an alternative which would not be inconceivable. And when you dig into his mode of inquiry and the framework that he's using to investigate these things, you realize that he's actually just using the tools of kalam itself. Okay? Again, making it extremely strange when someone attempts to say that his posture towards kalam was that it's unnecessary or irrelevant or something. Anyway, so what's the crux of his method of inquiry? He says, look, if it's possible to doubt them, then we treat them as false or unreliable. And we repeat this until we find something that we are unable to doubt. Now, that doesn't mean that he actually thinks that these things are false or that they're actually unreliable. Okay, for example, if I parked my car outside in my driveway and now I'm here inside and I can no longer see my car, can I say that I have knowledge, i.e. absolute certainty of where my car is? The answer is no. And it's because we are able to doubt whether I actually do know where my car is. And so it's not real knowledge because of that. Like, i.e. I parked my car in the driveway and now I'm inside this room. So do I know where my car actually is? Like, do I have knowledge of where it is that I left my car, of where my car is, sorry. And because it's possible for us to doubt, we can imagine, for instance, that the car was towed or that the car was stolen or destroyed or something like that. So possibilities, correct? Now that doesn't mean that I really do think that it's actually false that my car is out there. It just means that I don't know it. I can't say that I have knowledge of that fact. I'm not certain of it. And the reason is because the potential to doubt is there. So the point is, Ghazali is not saying that these things are actually false, but only that they cannot serve as a foundation because they are not necessary. And because he wants to find a foundation which is undoubtable. And then from there, we can build on top of that. Okay, so by possible to doubt, he literally means any possibility whatsoever. So we're trying, basically, we have a belief and we want to think of any possible scenario in where that belief could be false. So we're to think of like any rational possibility. And the reason that we're doing this is that if we allow all of those things, it'll guarantee that whatever cannot be doubted really is certain. So if we can find something that was truly undoubtable in the sense that, we could use it in a valid argument, for instance, like a syllogism, the conclusions of those things would allow for us to be able to say that we actually have knowledge of them. So this roughly describes the strategy, okay? And he agrees with the logicians that this is a good way to build knowledge, i.e. if you start with true premises in a valid syllogism, then you're guaranteed true conclusions, or in other words, that we can demonstrate for him here the veracity of our first principles. So then he says, فانتهى بطول التشكيك إلى أن لم تسمح نفسي بتسليم الآمان في المحسوسات أيضا. So he says that I arrived at the understanding that in my trying to incite doubt in myself of these things, that I could not actually accept that what my sense perceptions were giving me were in fact certain. And that began to spread even farther. وتقول من أين الثقة بالمحسوسات وأقواها حاسة البصر وهي تنظر إلى الظل فتراه واقفا غير متحرك وتحكم بنفي الحركة ثم بالتجربة والمشاهدة بعد ساعة تعرف أنه متحرك وأنه لم يتحرك دفعة بغتة بل على التدريج ذرة ذرة حتى لم يكن له حالة وقوف. So he says that this doubt actually began to expand, okay? And my sense perceptions would say to me, where are you finding the reliability in these senses? And we know that the strongest of senses is sight. And yet you look at, for instance, a shadow and you assume that it's still. And the only way that you know it's not is that you look later and you realize that it has moved. Right? So the intellect, saying here, the intellect makes a judgment that it actually was never still. Okay. وتنظر إلى الكوكب فتراه صغيرا في مقدار دينار ثم الأدلة الهندسية تدل على أنه أكبر من الأرض في المقدار. And another example, he says that you'll look at the celestial spheres, for instance, and you see them as small, maybe the size of a dinar. But the geometric computation, which provides proof, okay, for what it is that you're actually seeing, shows you that these things are actually bigger than the world itself. Okay. So he begins by pointing out that our senses are unreliable. And he gives these examples. Okay, the shadow, you assume it's still, you don't see it as in the moment that you're perceiving the shadow, you don't see it moving, but you realize from experience that at one moment it was there, and then you looked at a different moment and it was in a different place. And so the intellect then comes in and says, it must never have been still, even though you perceive it to be still. Or that the sun looks small when we know by reason that the sun is many times the size of the earth. And there are other things like this. For example, you can say straight things look bent in water, and that round things look oval when they're held at an angle. Or that square things look round because, and this would have been a product of his time maybe, if you were very far away from, you know, a particular tower or something, and you're approaching it from horseback or camelback, the farther away you were, the tower would look roundish. And as you get closer, you notice that it was actually square. Or that mountains look purple. Right? So we would say, we know the quote, purple mountain majesties. We may say purple mountain majesties, but mountains only look that way because of the haze and the tint due to the atmosphere between us and them. Right? So then he says, هذا وامثاله من المحسوسات يحكم فيها حاكم الحس بأحكامه ويكذبه حاكم العقل والتجربة تكذيبا لا سبيل إلى مدافعته. So these things, these proofs basically, and they're like in relationship to sense perceptions, judge on the basis of what it is that they sense. And then they're falsified by rational judgments or experiential judgments in a way that cannot be defended against. Okay? So we can doubt that what our senses tell us is accurate, and as a result of which they can't be the foundation. Now, of course, again, we say it again, this doesn't mean that Ghazali actually thinks that these sensory illusions are in fact happening, but what he's looking for is certainty. And what he's trying to show is that you don't get certainty from the senses, because it's really easy to doubt the way that the senses present things. And so he says, rational judgments negate these empirical judgments in a way that cannot be defended against. فقلت قد بطلت الثقة بالمحسوسات أيضا. So I said then that I cannot rely on sense perceptions as well. فلعله لا ثقة إلا بالعقليات التي هي من الأوليات، فقولنا العشرة أكثر من الثلاثة والنفي والإثبات لا يجتمعان في الشيء الواحد في حالة واحدة، والشيء الواحد لا يكون حادثا قديما موجودا معدوما واجبا محالا. So perhaps the only thing that we can rely on is our rational judgments, which make up our first principles, right? So he says, look, the senses are unreliable. What about rational knowledge? Okay. And these are things like, we know 10 is more than 3, or that one cannot affirm and deny one thing at the exact same time in the exact same location, or a thing cannot be both incipient and eternal. Like it couldn't have begun and eternal at the same time, or existent and non-existent at the same time, or necessary and impossible, okay, at the same time. فقالت المحسوسات. So then my sense perceptions, in recognizing this, my sense perceptions said, بما تأمن أن تكون ثقتك بالعقليات كثقتك بالمحسوسات وقد كنت واثقا بي. So how can you be assured that your reliance on these rational judgments are not like your reliance that you once had on your sense perceptions? And you used to be very secure, right? You used to think that things that you knew through your sense perception were in fact true. And he says, فَجَاءَ حَاكِمُ الْعَقْلِ فَكَذَّبَنِي. And then the rational judgment came and falsified that which you knew through your senses. وَلَوْلَا حَاكِمُ الْعَقْلِ لَكُنْتَ تَسْتَمِرُّ عَلَى تَصْدِيقِي. And had it not been for this rational judgment, you would have continued to believe that which you thought you knew through your sense perceptions. فَلَعَلَّ وَرَاءَ إِدْرَاكِ الْعَقْلِ حَاكِمًا آخَرَ. Perhaps that beyond these rational cognitions, there is another judge, there is another judgment, okay? إِذَا تَجَلَّ كَذَّبَ الْعَقْلِ فِي حُكْمِهِ. And if it becomes manifest, it would falsify that which you rationally know to be true. كما تجلى حاكم العقل فكذب الحس من في حكمه. Just as the rational judgment came and falsified that which you knew through your senses. وعدم تجلي ذلك الإدراك لا يدل على استحالته. And simply the non-existence of your knowledge of a thing is not the same as your knowledge of its non-existence. Okay, and so this is this is a qaida, this is a axiom of the ulama, that simply your lack of knowledge of an existence of a thing is not itself knowledge of its non-existence. I mean, you just don't know it, but doesn't mean that it's not actually there. So Ghazali says, look, one can point to the fact that rational knowledge, likewise, in this scenario, could be doubted given what you that what you know to be necessary rationally is in this world. Okay, and similar to what you knew or thought you knew of the world could likewise be an illusion, and that there's actually a deeper reality where even rational knowledge is no longer viable. So just like how you were convinced that your reliance on empirical knowledge was sound only to be dispelled by rational judgments, so too could there be something beyond rational judgments that could come and dispel that which you thought you had knowledge of through rational means. Okay. And then he says this general axiom that, look, the absence of the knowledge of a thing is not proof that it's not existent. And so at academia, one can actually confer a conclusion based on the absence of data. They call it an argument a silentio or an argumentum ex silentio, an argument from silence, where one derives a conclusion based on the absence of a particular thing rather than from its presence. The point there, though, is that you have to be sure that you're not making a hasty conclusion. Like, there's a whole lot of contextualization that has to go into you actually being able to make that type of a conclusion and say that there's reason why we believe that to be true. Like, the author should have mentioned X, Y, and Z, and he doesn't, for instance. Okay. So this is where Ghazālī now is kind of at. All right.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
In regards to the logical knowledge that we can conclude to, wouldn't 1 + 1 = 2 always be that, regardless of any other knowledge?
Right. So what is Ghazālī actually saying here? He's saying, look, it's not that I don't think that it's actually true, 1 + 1 = 2. But I'm just wondering that the same way that the things that I thought I knew through my sense perceptions that turned out to be false, given that there was a judge, right, an arbiter to this situation through my rational judgments that came and dispelled those truths. Well, what's to say that there isn't some other judgment that could come and dispel the way that I know what I think I know through these rational means, like 1 + 1 = 2. Like, what's to say there isn't a world beyond the world that I know right now where these rational judgments are actually false? So this is where he's at now. Okay.
But is that possible though, for something to dispel? Like, if we know what 1 is, know what plus and all that.
Well, let's just see where he takes us.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Let's just see where he takes us with all of this, because. But this is the argument that he has put on himself. All right. I just want to make sure. Does everybody understand the argument? We'll parse it later, and he's going to parse it himself. But just as long as you understand where he's at right now, then we're good. Okay. So then he says, فَتَوَقَّفَتِ النَّفْسُ فِي جَوَابِ ذَلِكَ قَلِيلًا. So I was unable to actually give a reply, like to give an answer to this particular concept, okay, for a bit of time. Like I didn't know how to reply to the conclusion that I had just made. وأيدت إشكالها بالمنام وقالت أما تراك تعتقد في النوم أمورا وتتخيل أحوالا وتعتقد لها ثباتا واستقرارا ولا تشك في تلك الحالة فيها ثم تستيقظ فتعلم أنه لم يكن لجميع متخيلاتك ومعتقداتك أصل وطائل. And so he said, I wasn't able to provide an answer to the objection that I had, and my sense perceptions reinforced the sort of difficulty by an appeal to dreams. And they said, don't you see that when you're asleep, you believe certain things and you imagine certain realities and you believe that they are true. And there's no doubt that comes up in relationship to your establishing their truth. But then you wake up and you know that all of the things that you had imagined and all the beliefs that you had were actually groundless and unsubstantiated. So while everything that you believe, so in other words, this is the sort of like matrix paradigm, right? How do you know that this all isn't just a big dream, is what Imam al-Ghazālī here is trying to get at. فبما تأمن أن يكون جميع ما تعتقده في يقظتك بحس أو عقل هو حق بالإضافة إلى حالتك التي أنت فيها. So just like you understand when you dream and you think that it's real and then you wake up, how are you sure that all of the things that you believe right now in your wakeful state, like for instance through sense perceptions and through the intellect, are themselves the truth in relationship to this particular situation that you're in right now. In other words, that there could be something else beyond this wakeful state that show that everything that you thought here is similar to what you thought of in your dreams. لكن يمكن أن تطرأ عليك حالة تكون نسبتها إلى يقظتك كنسبة يقظتك إلى منامك. And then perhaps the things that you knew, like you just basically just repeated it, right? The things that you knew in the state when you were dreaming, that you then came to understand further when you were awake, that they're unsubstantiated and not true. This itself could happen again in your wakeful state. وتكون يقظتك نوما بالإضافة إليها. And that your wakeful state actually is a type of sleep in relationship to these things. فإذا وردت تلك الحالة تيقنت أن جميع ما توهمت بعقلك خيالات لا حاصل لها. Okay. And so you become very aware and convicted that the things that you thought that you knew were actually unsubstantiated. ولعل تلك الحالة ما يدعيها الصوفية أنهم حالتهم. Right? And he says, and look, this isn't even far-fetched, okay? Because the Sufis claim that this is actually their state. And he says, إذ يزعمون أنهم يشاهدون في أحوالهم التي لهم إذا غاصوا في أنفسهم وغابوا عن حواسهم أحوالا لا توافق هذه المعقولات. Because they allege that in the states that they experience, when they concentrate inwardly and they suspend sensations, they see phenomena that are not necessarily in accord with the rational understandings of things. ولعل تلك الحالة هي الموت. And perhaps it's death. Like perhaps this state is actually death. إذ قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الناس نيام فإذا ماتوا انتبهوا. Because the Prophet ﷺ said that people are actually asleep. And when they die, they wake up. So how do you know that there isn't something else? فلعل الحياة الدنيا نوم بالإضافة إلى الآخرة. So maybe it's this life where we're asleep in relationship to the next life where we're actually awake. فإذا مات ظهرت له الأشياء على خلاف ما يشاهده الآن ويقال له عند ذلك فكشفنا عنك غطاءك فبصرك اليوم حديد. And so when he dies, or when the person dies, the things become manifest in distinction, right, or in opposition to that which they are witnessing right now. And that they're told, and he cites the ayah of the Quran, but we have removed from you your veil, and today your sight is keen, right? فَلَمَّا خَطَرَتْ لِي هَذِهِ الْخَوَاطِرُ. So now, the point that he's making, and I think everybody gets it, right, is that these standards of thought may simply be what we perceive of them in this world. But what's the proof that they are also not an illusion like our senses were? And what's to say that we're not veiled from something greater as a product of our being in this world? So at the end of the day, Ghazali is looking to interrogate the very foundations of our knowledge of reality. Like, what is the proof that any of this is not an illusion and can be trusted? And so then he says, فَلَمَّا خَطَرَتْ لِي هَذِهِ الْخَوَاطِرُ. Okay. When these thoughts occurred to me, وانقدحت في النفس, and they penetrated my soul. حاولت لذلك علاجا فلم يتيسر. I tried to deal with the objections, but I couldn't do that. Why? إذ لم يمكن دفعه إلا بدليل. Because I could not refute these things except with a proof. ولم يمكن نصب دليل إلا من تركيب العلوم الأولية. And I can't actually provide a proof, since a proof would have to be on the basis of some first principle, okay, some presupposition. فإذ لم تكن مسلمة, and if we can't get there, لم يكن ترتيب دليل. So then I won't be able to actually provide a proof. So now this is again where he's at. فأعضل هذا الداء. فأعضل هذا الداء. So this particular malady or this illness set in, basically. Okay. ودام قريبا من شهرين. And it stayed with me like this for nearly 2 months. أنا فيهما على مذهب السفسطة بحكم الحال لا بحكم النطق والمقال. So he says ودام قريبا من شهرين أنا فيهما على مذهب السفسطة بحكم الحال لا بحكم النطق والمقال. So I was like this for 2 months, and one can say that I was in a state of skepticism, but in a state of skepticism not in utterance and in doctrine. In other words, like I didn't actually go forth with it or actually believe it. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't have a way out of it, is kind of what he's saying. Okay. حتى شفى الله تعالى من ذلك المرض والاعتلال وعادت النفس إلى الصحة والاعتدال ورجعت الضروريات العقلية مقبولة وموثوقا بها على أمن ويقين. And then what happened? God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, cured me of this sickness. And my soul regained its trust in these rational judgments that I had in a way that was completely certain again. Okay. So he says basically that this question of reasonable doubt on the basis of something that cannot be established ostensibly, okay, because one can't lift themselves from it without a proof, like he's saying. But there is no proof that one can physically provide for it. So it's a type of what they call a vicious circle. Okay. You're just going around in a circle. You don't get anywhere. And so he says, I was affected by this for a while. He says 2 months. And so I was actually a skeptic, but not in terms of my actual belief for something that I was doing, but rather I was in a state of skepticism and I didn't know how to get myself out of it. And what cures him? What allows him to begin the journey knowing full well that things are real and that this isn't the Matrix or Inception, right? All right. I don't know if there's probably another movie out there that I don't know that also updates all this. Allah, yeah. Allah. The only real foundation is God. Like God places the capacity in us, our creation, to come to know that which is real as what we call badahi or badihi, okay, intuitively or axiomatic to our nature. And it's in your trust of that that allows you to actually go anywhere. Okay, now one can say, well, doesn't that mean that he's asserting that God, our understanding of God, is badihi, like that's just intuitive? No, he's not. He knows the conclusion, so he recognizes where this is ultimately coming from. But the main point that he's making is that there is a part of you that intuitively knows that these things are real. Okay, what you see, what you touch, and your recognition of these conclusions, right, through your rational cognitions, are in fact real, and you know that they are real. And you also recognize purpose behind it, right? So to trust that there's an actual conclusion to all of these things that you're coming to know. Like when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, was this all in vain? Right? You have an understanding of that. For instance, I come to your door, I knock on your door, you open the door and you say, hi. I say, hey. And you're like, what's up? And I'm like, not much. you recognize that there must be something, right? There has to be a purpose for like what's going on here. Even if my purpose was just like, yeah, I'm just here to say hi, or I was in the area or whatever. But for somebody to assume like, well, why would you even assume that? What Imam al-Ghazālī here is saying is that no, that's intuitive. Okay. And that thing is something that all human beings have. All right. And so similarly, then we draw those same conclusions when we're talking about, the things that we come to know, and that recognizing that there must be, the very question, like, what am I doing here? You intuitively recognize that there must be an answer to that question. What am I doing here? Now, all of this is brought to fruition, one can say, in this paragraph coming up. So he continues and he says, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ ذَلِكَ بِنَظْمِ الدَّلِيلِ وَتَرْتِيبِ كَلَامٍ. The way that I was brought into solidly having an understanding of these things again, okay, recognizing that these things are real, was not through some sort of evidence or through a theological proof. بل بنور قذفه الله تعالى في الصدر. It was a light that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in my chest. وذلك النور هو مفتاح أكثر المعارف. And this light is a key to much of knowledge. فمن ظن أن الكشف موقوف على الأدلة المحررة فقد ضيق رحمة الله تعالى الواسعة. This is a very famous line of Imam al-Ghazālī in this text, where he says, this key is the key, this light is the key to much of knowledge, and whoever thinks that the unveiling of truth is somehow, how can we say this, dependent or contingent upon precisely formulated proofs, has indeed straightened the broad mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. And part of the reason, and we'll get into this as we move along, but part of the reason is that Imam al-Ghazālī recognizes that there are many more avenues that one can take in order to know that something is true, okay, with yaqeen, i.e. that you have a solid understanding of it, to be certain that there's no doubt that arises from it, than simply the ability that you have as a human being to discursively arrive there. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a second. ولما سئل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الشرح ومعناه في قوله تعالى فمن يرد الله أن يهديه يشرح صدره للإسلام قال هو نور يقذفه الله تعالى في القلب فيشرح له الصدر فقيل وما علامته قال التجافي في دار الغرور والإنابة إلى دار الخلود صلى الله عليه وسلم. So when the apostle of God, peace and blessings be upon him, was asked about the expansion, sharh, okay, in the verse of Allah saying, so he whom God wishes to guide aright, he expands his chest for embracing Islam, or to embrace Islam. Okay, and then he says that this light is, that this expansion is a light which God casts into the heart. Okay, and then it was asked, well, what is the sign? Like, how do we know that it's there? And then he replies, the withdrawal from the abode of delusion and turning to the abode of immortality. And what he's trying to say here is that you're no longer attached to this world, but rather your attachment is to the next world. You're no longer attached to the world that is full of delusion. You're attached to the world where things last forever, right? Where you're actually from, where we all aspire to go to. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to arrive there. So it's this initial thing that the human being has that allows for them to be able to see things clearly, one can say. Okay. وهو النور الذي قال صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله تعالى خلق الخلق في ظلمة ثم رش عليهم من نوره. And this is the light that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the creation in darkness and then sprinkled over them from his light. And then he says, فمن ذلك النور ينبغي أن يطلب الكشف وذلك النور ينبجس من الجود الإلهي في بعض الأحيين ويجب الترصد له كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم إن لربكم في أيام دهركم نفحات ألا فتعرضوا لها. And it is from this light that one should seek the unveiling of truth. Okay. And here what's very important, and we talked a lot about this in our course on getting our minds right, when he talks about kashf, when he talks about the unveiling of truth, this is the unveiling of things as they really are. In other words, that you see things as they really are, which human beings, you know, sometimes are able to, I mean, on the sort of normal level, sometimes an individual may be able to arrive there, sometimes they may not be able to arrive there. That you capture the essence of what a thing is, right? And so what Imam al-Ghazālī is saying is that that concept is something that Allah has given us in certain capacities that are, one can say, intuitive. Like you recognize that you don't even recognize that they're there, right? Because you don't think about them. It's not like you're sitting here wondering, like, am I looking at something that is real right now? Like, is Fouad real? Is he really talking to me? You don't think that, right? Because you've grasped the reality of this particular situation in that light, right? So Imam al-Ghazālī here is saying, so it's this light, okay, this capacity that is given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this very subtle thing that we as human beings should seek unveilings from. And that these things ultimately come from a divine grace that he has given to us, okay? And so we should seek to avail ourselves of these graces. In other words, we do that which is upon us to do as human beings, and then ultimately Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings us there. He allows for those things to have efficacy, a reality to them. And then he says, as the Prophet ﷺ said, that indeed that your Lord in the days of your lifetime sends forth spiritual breezes. So avail yourselves of these things. Right? And so we know oftentimes during the blessed days of Ramadan or the blessed nights in the last 10 nights or in Ashura or the variety of different times that we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given a type of higher capacity in these days, in these moments, in these places, oftentimes in Mecca and Medina. And so he's saying, when you've arrived at these places, avail yourself of these spiritual breezes. When I've put them out there, avail yourself to these things. Okay. And so ultimately, again, all of it goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that one has to have a kind of trust that what you're experiencing, what you know to be real in these intuitive capacities that you have, they're real. And when you move forward on the basis of that reality as first principles, you can come to the very necessary conclusions that God is real, what the religion of God is, who the Prophet is, so on and so forth, and then begin that journey in this very real way. Now, all of this is brought to a type of completion at this last paragraph where he says, وَالْمَقْصُودُ مِنْ هَذِهِ الْحِكَايَةِ أَنْ تَعْلَمْ كَمَالَ الْجِدِّ فِي الطَّلَبِ حيث انتهى إلى طلب ما لا يطلب فإن الأوليات ليست مطلوبة فإنها حاضرة والحاضر إذ طلب فقد واختفى ومن طلب ما لا يطلب فلا يتهم بالتقصير في طلب ما يطلب. Okay, so what does this mean? He says the aim of this account is to emphasize that one should be very diligent in seeking the truth until one comes to seeking that which is unseekable. All right? Because first principles are unseekable because they are present with one in the mind. And when that which is present is sought, it's actually lost or it hides itself. But the one who seeks that which is unseekable cannot. And subsequently then he says, so do not be negligent in seeking that which is unseekable, and you risk or you cost yourself from seeking the things that actually one should be seeking. In other words, you spend time engaging in that which is going to be of no benefit to you. Okay, and this is where this entire summation of this particular section comes to fruition, one can say, in that he recognizes that he has spent a considerable amount of time trying to inquire about something that ultimately became a kind of waste of time. A waste of time from what? A waste of time from him actually being able to move forth, from the things that are actually real, like they're intuitive in a sense. And from there being able then to grow as a human being and to arrive at the conclusions that ultimately all of us seek to arrive at. So in this paragraph, he aims to make something very, very clear. The first one, as he says, is the problem of skepticism only comes about when one assumes that first principles are demonstrable, like that they can be proven by demonstration in the same way that inferential propositions can be proven. Okay, so like we said before, there are two, we demarcated knowledge into two types. There's knowledge that is self-evident, they're non-inferentials, and then you have inferentials, things that have to be thought about and arrived at through a type of progression, right? Those things that are daruri, in other words, they're non-inferential, the assumption that one can provide an inferential basis to them is false. Okay, this assumption is false in and of itself. So the problem of skepticism, as Imam al-Ghazālī says here, goes away once a person understands that every belief that we have does not need to be proven through a demonstrative argument. And notice here that what he's actually saying is in relationship to what? It's in relationship to us having a reliability in the things that we know intuitively, those things that are evident in and of themselves, that one should not need to provide a demonstration for. That concept in and of itself is not some sort of like mystical awakening or a spiritual understanding that one, really needs to get beyond any type of like rational understanding in order for one to actually grasp. It's very common sense. Okay, the problem with skepticism goes away when you understand that every belief that we have does not need to be proven through a demonstrative argument. And when you assume that these very first principles that are themselves self-evident, okay, when you assume that those first principles are demonstrable in the same way that inferential propositions are demonstrable, you end up in this particular you end up in this place. And this is, by the way, a standard foundationalist account of what, and we had talked about this before, what foundationalist actually means. And it involves granting, as the mutakallimun all did, the various types of daruri knowledge, the various types of non-inferential knowledges as being something that is in and of itself justified or justifiable. Okay, so and through non-inferential means, meaning that you don't have to demonstrate the veracity of these things in order for them to be true. So rational first principles, badihi things, okay, they're true. Experience, the mujarrab that you have, they're true. The sense perceptions, okay, the intuitional, one can say, or intuitive inferences, hadas, okay, they're same. You have natural or evident premises, which are fitri things. The mutawatir reports, these widely transmitted or diffused congruence of reports. And then you also have other ones as well, like introspection and wujdan. So this is where we're going to end, inshallah. But inshallah, we're able to come to an understanding, and this is the end of the section anyways. From here, he gets into now al-qawlu fi asnaf al-talibin. But inshallah, we hopefully provided some sort of clarity through what Imam al-Ghazālī actually wrote on this particular issue into what it is that he's actually doing. Now that he knows, like, he can rely on the things that should be reliable and should in fact give one sound knowledge, and then that which gives one necessary knowledge that you can build all of this from and begin your investigation of what is true and what is false. You see the way that he dealt with this particular issue of skepticism. And skepticism in the books, like our books, for instance, they don't really deal with skepticism. The ulama begin at the assumption that, you know, existence is real and we exist in the things that we see and we're able to, you know, directly perceive, and that which we know through rational demonstration are in fact true. And anybody who tries to say like otherwise, like, well, I don't know if I'm here, I don't know if I'm dreaming right now, they don't really deal with it all that much because it's so beyond normal life to a degree that one can't even honestly engage it. Like, you couldn't normally live your life. Like, you would have, like, people would think that, not just think, but you would in fact probably have some sort of psychological issue if you actually saw life in that way. Okay. And so as a result of which, we also see that the ulama don't spend too much time with it. What's interesting is that Imam al-Ghazālī kind of tries to show you, because he's also saying, in order for me to actually bring you to the conclusion that I'm going to bring you through, I have to basically show you that we start at the beginning of the beginning and we flesh through that particular idea, just so that nobody can come in and try to say, well, and I've had this conversation before. It's very interesting where people, you have a conversation and then you almost get to a conclusion and they'll say, well, how do you even know that we're here? You know, I don't even. In other words, they begin to question these very evident premises. Okay. What did our ulama say? Our ulama told us that if somebody actually does that and actually believes it, that you should just hit him in the head. And if they say, hey, why'd you do that? Say, well, how do you know I did it? How do you know I exist? I don't know. Maybe I don't. And if they say, no, you did it. Then, khalas, they refuted their own madhab. Okay. Don't actually do that. But in other words, that's what they're trying to say. Like, look, not every issue, not every matter needs to be investigated in this way. Not every matter needs to actually be treated, because the majority of people, the overwhelming bulk of the humanity recognizes these things to be honestly true, reliably true. And so when we can start from that very premise, we're able to foundationally say that this experience that I'm having, these things that I can perceive in the moment, and my rational knowledge do in fact provide me with things that I can say I know with certainty and I can't doubt. All right. And on the basis of that, we can know certain things in this way, and we can use those tools then to examine, well, what do these religions actually say? And are any of these things in any way counterintuitive, right? Or is it asking me to do something that would rationally be inconsistent or inconceivable, or what's the deal here? And you can have complete conviction that the things that you know in this way, if they do not appear, as Imam al-Ghazālī says in the beginning, if they do not appear, irregardless of whatever the person is telling you. Somebody tries to tell you, no, 10 is not greater than 3. I know that it is. No, it's not. And here, look, this telephone, I turned it into a snake. He says the only thing that I would think at that point was, wow, that's amazing. How did you do that? But I still don't think that 10 is still greater than 3. There's nothing. And so this becomes important, because what happens when somebody comes down and starts doing miraculous things and says, I'm God? Immediately the believer will be able to say, no. God's not physical and contingent, and he doesn't have these things. God is transcendent beyond all of that. And there's nothing that you can do that would make me doubt that. That's why this is such an important conversation, and why Muslims really should, to some level, grapple with it to understand what's going on here. Like why do we even think about the basis of this in this particular manner? We'll end here, inshallah. We'll take any questions if you have any.
Assalamu alaikum. For that last paragraph, could you explain a little more? It is kind of like a mind twister when it says, and if what is present and sought for becomes hidden and lost, when, however, a man seeks what is sought, he is not accused of falling short.
Yeah, don't worry about the translate. The translations are, they're not great.
Okay.
Yeah. But in other words, what he's trying to say is that, look, things that are present with you do not have to be sought after. Because when you do, you actually lose sight of them. And so rather than constantly seeking after that which is unseekable, seek after that which is seekable, because that is worth your time. Seeking after that which is unseekable is not worth your time. So he's kind of giving you the khulasa, which is what Imam al-Ghazālī is trying to do. He's saying, look, just learn from my experiences. Don't go do this. Don't go have some existential crisis after you watch The Matrix and begin to think, is any of this real? How do I know what's going on? Oh my God, where am I? Am I Muslim? Is Islam the real religion? How do I even know anything? How can we? No, don't do that. Learn from Imam al-Ghazālī. He says, don't do that. What the very question that has to be asked, in order to arrive at that particular state, is a false question, because it assumes that the things that are self-evident need to be demonstrated, which no longer makes them self-evident. In other words, if they're non-inferential, you do not need to prove them through inferential means. They're non-inferential. All right.
All right, yeah, Jazakallah. And what does non-inferential mean?
In other words, they don't need to be demonstrated.
Okay.
Yeah, you don't have to provide a proof. Like vibe with me here. Am I here?
Yeah.
What's your dalil?
I see you. I'm interacting with you.
But what's your dalil that what you see is real? That's the point. That's the point that he's saying.
Okay, yeah,
that's a dumb question.
Yeah.
Okay. And the reason it's dumb is because if you want the technicality as to what is actually being done here, is that you're asking somebody for dalil for that which is self-evident.
Okay. So how do we differentiate from things that are self-evident from things that are rational or otherwise?
Well, remember, we're not saying that, because something that certain rationalities or rational cognitions can be non-inferential or daruri. Okay. Like when we say half of 2 is 1. It's daruri. 10 is greater than 3. And those are rational cognitions.
All right. All right, appreciate it. Thank you.
So in other words, you don't need, these things can come through a variety of different means. And that's the point that he also is making here. Like, and this is no different than any of the other mutakallimun, or any of the other mutakallimun thought. Like there are various types of daruri knowledge. Okay. And all of them are justified as being daruri, non-inferential. You don't need to demonstrate them. Rational first principles are experience, sense perception, intuitive inferences that one has, fitri things, okay, like the natural predisposition that one has, so on and so forth. Any other questions? Anybody ever watch Inception? Did you come out of that movie thinking, oh my God, what's going on?
I had a headache after watching that movie.
Yeah, as most people should, yeah. But, and these things, honestly, they come up oftentimes when you're, trying to speak to people about certain things, the conclusions that we make. I mean, if we use these things as a method to establish the veracity of our religion, one of the points that often will come up from people is, well, how do I know anything? And how do I know that these things that I know are actually knowledge? Like, that's what Ghazālī is treating here. And what's interesting is that people usually wait until you arrive at the final conclusion of an argument or of a proposition before they go, well, how do I even know I'm here? We like to have a good opinion of people, but sometimes it feels like a cop-out. It's just like, well, there's nothing left that I have, so let me throw the skeptic card out there.
Assalamu alaikum, Ustadh. I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned, someone might come be doing these miraculous things, pretending to be a god, right? So that reminds me of the Dajjal. Are there specific things that we can do other than reading Surah Kahf that you could mention to protect us in those times? Because how much is our reason going to help us at that time?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very strong trial. And in many ways, the hadith reports that talk about it, can really make somebody quite anxious about this whole thing. But at the end of the day, I would say that this becomes imperative for you to recognize that the things that you know as necessary knowledge, you know them absolutely certainty. Okay, and that there is the miracle in and of itself is not something that takes that away. I mean, if somebody comes down claiming prophethood and you become susceptible simply on the basis that this person is just doing miracles, while at the very same time saying things like there's 5 gods, and I'm the prophet of all 5 of them. And here, and here's all these miracles. It's a very hard test, but the way out of it, ultimately, like we're saying, is for you to recognize that it's impossible. And that knowledge that I have through that rational means, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me that blessing to be able to understand that, then, I should know it in this way and be convicted of it. And like Imam al-Ghazālī is going to show, that simply having that understanding isn't in and of itself going to be, the reason why you're motivated by it. So you can have yaqeen in something, like we said before, but You're not necessarily motivated too much by it. So then this is where, see, Mustafa's talking about, well, there are other things that we can do then. You begin to put those truths into practice. You read Surah Al-Kahf, you memorize the first 10 verses of Surah Al-Kahf, or you memorize the last 10 verses in one narration of Surah Al-Kahf. And all of these things become your protection from the Dajjal. And staying close to the community, scholars, the people of knowledge, the people of piety, all of these things then begin to not only re-engage, but uplift those things that you know. And so the more that you're on your deen in that way and constantly sort of striving to stay on it and to get further and to progress, all of that will help Ibn Ta'ala.
Jazakallah, Ustad.
Yeah. Khair, any other questions?
I have one last one, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Were there certain tools or skill sets that Imam Ghazālī equipped himself with before he began going into these different ideologies and religions and everything?
Well, just as a product of his time and his study, he would have learned, he did know, for instance, logic, rhetoric, grammar. He knew the basic understanding of his belief systems, so on and so forth, which become kind of foundational to one's worldview and also the way in which you navigate different worldviews. So he had those tools available. And so this is why I'm saying it's profoundly important for our generation to become much more accustomed to these things, particularly because of the fact that we live in a place where, we're the minority, and what we are bombarded with on a daily basis really necessitates that one has a very strong understanding of why the religion is true. And then, as we've said before, multiple times, you can see how there are different methods maybe, or a different amount of substance that one needs for, to treat it as a public thing. So there are some people who are much more academic and they may need more. There are some people who, very simple people, and they don't need a lot of it. But I would say that we're in a time right now where you really need to wrap your head around some of these basic tools. And you say, wow, that's so much. And, do I really need them? And this is coming from somebody who's like studying medicine, or chemical engineering. Or yes, you do. If you can go to school for 12 years, higher education, studying the intricacies of biology and whatever, but you can't spend like a weekend wrapping your head around just the basic tools of thought that your tradition, your religion sets up in order for you to understand your belief system and your tradition. I don't know, it just seems lazy to me. Okay. So we'll begin next week, inshallah, where he'll actually begin to take us through the different groups, and we'll begin to examine each group, inshallah. صلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى اله وصحبه وسلم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى ولك الحمد اذا رضيت ولك الحمد بعد الرضا ولك الحمد كالذي نقول خير مما نقول ولك الحمد كالذي تقول ولك الحمد على كل حال. اللهم انا نسالك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى. اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل. اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل. اللهم انا نسالك العفو والعافيه والمعافاه الدائمه في الدين والدنيا والاخره. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. اللهم يا الله يا الله يا الله بجاه أسماء الله وصفات الله ورسل الله وأنبياء الله والصالحين من عباد الله اللهم اقضي حوائجنا ظاهرا وباطنا اللهم اقضي حوائجنا ظاهرا وباطنا نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وارنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه اللهم ارزقنا حسن الخاتمة اللهم أيقظ قلوبنا ونبهنا من الغفلة عنك اللهم أيقظ قلوبنا ونبهنا من الغفلة عنك واجعل آخر كلامنا لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وآله عدد كمال الله وكما يليق بكماله سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us this gathering, to allow it to be a means that takes us into Jannah and not a means that puts us further away from Jannah or enters us into the hellfire. Ya Rabbil Alameen. We ask you, Ya Allah, to uplift our community, to uplift our families, and to uplift us, Ya Rabb, to make us beacons of light and those who carry that light forward with every person that we meet, and allow for this knowledge to be of benefit for ourselves and our families and our community. Barakallahu feekum wa jazakumullahu khair. Inshallah, we'll see everyone next week.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum salam.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.